what you remember is the things where you know you're going to die, but you don't. You're so sure you're going to die, but then you don't do it. You don't. And I had 2 occurrences like that.
In the very early stages of the Second World War, Canadian pilots and crew members flew with the British Royal Air Force. But as the war continued, and thousands of Canadian pilots and crew members were being trained back home, all Canadian squadrons were created.
When Dieppe occurred, a group of us, part of the squadron, we were the top cover. And because I was on really my first real operation, I stuck to the tail of my leader, and I didn't see very much really, just the tail of the aircraft. And we were top cover where there really wasn't much action. But down below you could see the smoke and the activity, and it was real hell. But that was my first introduction to operations.
Man, Spitfire, still an amazing looking aircraft.
Don't let her good looks fool you. She's fast and deadly. Just ask the Germans. They saw enough of them during the Battle of Britain.
Weren't they just throwing untested pilots into that battle? The Brits were so outnumbered.
Sometimes, but for the most part, procedure still has to be followed. Fighter pilots always have to watch and learn before they can get their feet wet.
Must have been hard for those rookie fighter pilots to just hang back and watch. Must have been itching to get into the fight.
If they did get into it, they'd be like a lamb to slaughter. It takes time to become a fighter pilot. Things are coming at you at breakneck speeds. You have to learn to make decisions before you can even think about them. You have to know how to avoid flaming out before you can notch up your own victories. It's not like us bombers who get put into the mix pretty much right away. If you're in a Spit, a Lank, or a cargo glider for that matter, on your first time out, you're scared like you never known what scared is. You get over it somewhat, but it's always on your mind, weighing you down. But the more I fly, the more I can control it.
It's like exams for me. The more I do them, the better I do.
But it's a little bit different up there. When you're in that insanity around you, all the training in the world can't give you what you really need to come back in one piece.
What's that?
Lady Luck.
The one flight that probably stands out in my mind is the second 109 that I shot down. You know, for 3.5 years overseas, I shot down 2 109s. On this one, we were flying as a squadron of 12, and I spotted a Jerry formation. I could tell it was the Jerrys from the way they flew. When they went through cloud, unlike us, they got into a line abreast, which made a lot of sense to me because then they all came out together. And I spotted this off in the distance, and I drew to the attention of the squadron leader. He couldn't see them. So he asked me to take over. I was leading a 4-man section. Take over and go in that direction, which I did, and after a while, he picked them up too. And somehow he was able to maneuver us so that we were flying in line abreast, right behind the Jerrys and 100 feet below them, and they hadn't spotted us. And at that point, he said, you know, every man for himself or something like that. And he opened fire on his, and I opened fire on mine. The one I had was carrying a 500-pound bomb under the belly. Well, he got rid of that in a hurry. And then he broke tighter than the first one I got, so tight that while I could turn inside him, I couldn't turn that last bit to lead him. If I tried shooting, I'd have just been wasting my shots. And he kept this up for about 3 turns, and then he pulled a stunt that I was aware of but hadn't encountered before, where he suddenly leveled off and closed the throttle. So immediately I have 3 choices to make: collide with him, turn to the left or to the right, in which case I would overshoot him, and then he'd be able to turn in behind me, and I'm a dead goose. So for some reason or other, I rammed on full rudder, put the ailerons in the opposite direction, and skidded flat out beside him, almost hit his tail, just missed his tail, slid out beside him. I was within a foot of his wingtip with my wingtip, and I was gradually sliding past him. So I fishtailed on the rudder to stop that, and we ended up flying wingtip to wingtip. And I can still remember looking across at the Jerry sitting there, and he had on a light-colored flying jacket of some kind, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and saying, who's gonna quit first? Well, I knew that his stalling speed was higher than mine, so he was gonna have to do something first. And what he did was open the throttle quick, and he left me about 300 yards behind. Well, I wasn't going to give him another chance to get into this turning business. So at about 300 yards with my sight right on his cockpit, I gave him a short burst, and immediately his canopy flew off. But he kept flying, so I gave him another short burst, and out comes the parachute. I looked around, and there was nobody in the sky. We're alone, the 2 of us. So then I thought, gee, nobody to witness it. I wouldn't be able to claim this, and I was determined I was gonna claim it. So I thought, I'll take his picture. So I came around in a big turn, got him nicely lined up with the camera, was just about to take his picture, and I realized I was going to hit him. I still had my throttle wide open from chasing him. So I throttled right back and came around in a bigger loop, circle, and caught him, and I have a perfect picture of him and his parachute going down. And after that, I came home. And I found out from the German records later that he had been wounded, whether with the first shot or the second, but that's why he jumped out. But believe it, the story is true.
Why was it called a dogfight? Why not clash of eagles, death duel in the skies? What do dogs have anything to do with flying?
Quit flapping your gums for a moment and I'll tell you. A dogfight is a fierce battle between 2 mad dogs fighting to the death. Really describes it, don't you think? 2 planes ducking and diving, spinning and shooting, hell-bent on destroying each other. And what's even crazier is most of these dogfights last on average no more than 30 seconds. And each Spitfire is only loaded with 15 seconds of continuous gunfire, so you do the math there, Andy. Those fighter pilots, they get the life, the glamour. A couple of quick engagements and they're back for afternoon tea and crumpets. It's not like us, Bomber Command. We're like the turtle and they're the hare.
But the turtle always wins. Slow and steady wins the race.
In this race, slow and steady gets you lined up in enemy gun sights and shot down. There's no glory in that.
So are you fighting for personal glory or to kill the enemy?
Maybe a little of both.
But is there really any glory in killing another human being?
I suppose there is if they're trying to kill you.
The Spitfire was light and maneuverable, fun to fly. The Typhoon wasn't, but it was exciting to fly because you were doing exciting things. What we could do with a Typhoon was attack columns of tanks, and every tank had to have men with them to operate that tank. Both the crews, the soldiers that went along and fought with that tank, German soldiers, the mechanics to work on the tanks, fuel, ammunition for the tank, all that kind of stuff. With a Typhoon, you could kill all those trucks and make a mess of them and block the roads, for the one thing. So to go down there, and for a Typhoon, it was like a shooting gallery. So it was a tank referred to as a tank buster, an excellent low-level attack aircraft, an excellent one. In doing our work, we were attacked quite frequently, more than occasionally, by American aircraft who had difficulty in recognizing the Typhoon as an Allied aircraft. It's the truth, and it should be told.
Our CO was new to Burma, new to that area. He'd been fighting in Europe and had a good name, but he had no experience with the topography there. And he told him after 3 roads, you can attack anything you see. It'd be enemy. So he counted 3 roads, but one of them wasn't a road, it was just a trail. So the next road, we saw trucks on it. So we started shooting them up, and they were a British Army unit. We fortunately didn't kill anybody.
To be killed by one of your own planes, that must have been the worst thing to happen to you over there. How's that even possible?
Happens all the time in war. Believe me, there are worse things in war.
Like what?
If you think hard enough, Andy, I'm sure you can come up with a few.
Normally in Spitfires, these were beautiful Spitfires. They didn't have gun sights or guns or anything. They had more fuel tanks in them, and they could go farther, and very smooth things. They would go out on an exercise if there's an attack somewhere that the Army wanted a picture of if there are any tanks in the area or something like that. They would take pictures. They had a camera that did a vertical and then 2 obliques. So they could fly down along close to a thing and take an oblique picture of it, or fly over and take a vertical.
I bet you never knew that in the First World War, the primary role of the aeroplane was to gather information to find out what the enemy was doing behind their trenches. It wasn't to shoot down the red bearing like some of them picture shows lead you to believe. No, sir. Solid reconnaissance saved lives in that war. Same is true in this one.
And they used a spit?
That's right, we use a spit. Multi-engine aircraft are just too slow, too easily picked off by Jerry fighters. Not the spit. Did you know that most are unarmed? They fly deep behind enemy lines, armed with only cameras, to find out what the Fuhrer is up to.
You know what they say, knowledge is power.
Really? I thought whoever had the biggest gun holds the power.
I'd been on patrol over London on eye for item beacon. Well, I took off way up into the Cambridge area. We caught up to a German airplane going out into the North Sea, and he was going home flat out. And it was a different model. It was either a 388 Junkers 88 or a 188. And my navigator, who was a real enthusiast on information like this, after we shot it, it was in flames and going down. He said, let's get in closer so I can give more information to the intelligence people when we get on the ground. That was the stupidest thing I ever did in my life. I moved on in, and as I was getting close, and the airplane was completely in flames, but the mid-upper gunner was still in his turret on this airplane, and I saw the turret moving around to come bear on me, and I broke as hard as I could to the left, and he started at about 6 inches from one wingtip and finished up 6 inches from the other wingtip, but 30-some rounds of 13 millimeter into my airplane, 2 or 3 through the cockpit. My navigator had perspex into his face and things, and one went up, we sat side by side, and one of the bullets went right through between the two of us, amongst other things. Well, both engines were badly shot up. One of them, the piston was shot right out of it on the right-hand engine, and I was going to crash land, the radio was still working at the big bomber crash strip in Norfolk, and they said, we can't take you because the air is littered with bombers coming back from a raid. So we tried, and we went on to Bradwell Bay, which was about another 50, 60 miles with this airplane in this shape. And we landed, and the one thing that was most interesting on that, when I put on the brakes, there weren't any brakes. One of the rounds had gone through the air bottles in the back, so I ground looped in the middle of the airfield, and there was the airplane just dripping fuel and all the rest. It never caught fire. And that, without a question of a doubt, was the most interesting one in the war.
You've heard of people who are cowards. In the First World War, they used to stand them up against the wall and shoot them. But in our war, they were called LMS, lack of moral fiber. So a South African lad was posted to the squadron. By this time, I was a flight leader, and he was assigned to me to train initially. The first time we took off, I was leading a flight onto I think it was an Army support operation. And we no sooner got airborne, and he said, my engine's giving me trouble. I have to return home. So this wasn't unusual. A lot of people on their first flight had imagined they had engine troubles. So we let him go home. I still had another 5 of us to do the job. The next time I took him up with just 2 of us, and we were going on an interdiction. And I could see miles ahead of dust rising off this road, and I knew there was something coming. So I said to this kid, arm your guns and put on your gun sight, be prepared, I'm going to fire on this target. As soon as we got within range, I did go in and I fired my guns. and looked, nothing happened. And I looked around, and here was dust coming up in the jungle about a quarter of a mile away. It was a new airplane, just been overhauled, had just come to the squadron, and they'd put me in it, and they'd never checked to see that the guns were harmonized. And instead of the guns pointing ahead, they were pointing over like this. So I passed over this target, and it was a touring car like Hitler used to ride, with 2 Japanese generals in it, and a driver. And I could see their red epaulets and collar tabs. And their car was half tilted over into the ditch, and they were running across to the jungle. But I looked to see the bullets from my number 2, and nothing happened. So I pulled up and I said, "Why didn't you fire on that target?" He said, "I don't see anything, sir. I don't see anything, sir." "What do you mean you don't see?" There was this pell of dust for miles leading straight to it. I said, "Okay, I'll fly low over this. It's a vehicle. When I'm directly over it, I'll tell you when, and then you go in and destroy it. You're not going to kill anybody because there's nobody in it. Just destroy it. You'll maybe extend the war, reduce the length of the war for by a few hours." And then I watched him. He didn't do anything, just flew around. I said, "Aren't you going to go and destroy that vehicle?" "I don't see anything, sir. I don't see anything, sir." That's all I kept saying that. So I guessed that he was an LMF by then, and we went home. But I thought I'd give him one more chance, and we went off with just the 2 of us the next again. But we no sooner got airborne when this kid said, "My engine's giving me trouble." I said, "Go on home. I'll talk to you when we get home." And I wasn't supposed to continue because we weren't allowed to fly singly. Supposed to be no less than 2. But I went anyway. And about 5 minutes later, I saw massive airplanes coming toward me. Just the sky was full of airplanes. As I passed under them, about 400 feet below them, of course, they all had rising suns. I roughly counted them, about 50 Japanese fighters. And I watched. I was, of course, frozen, stiff. But I watched them to see if any broke off from the formation, but they didn't. They just flew on. They flew right by me. So I called operations and gave the number of aircraft, exact position of them, and exact direction they were flying. But the kid obviously heard my message to operations, and he panicked. And he either landed with his brakes on, or he landed and tried to stop too fast. The engine stalled, and the Merlin engines made a lot of crackling noise when they were cooling down, and he was sure believed that his aircraft was on fire. Anyway, a bunch of troops that were in a slit trench on the side of the runway waiting for the Japanese ran out and lifted up the aircraft and hauled him out. And he was a raving maniac. They had to hold him down, took 4 of them to hold him down till the raid was over, and an ambulance come and took him away in a straitjacket. And I never saw him again.
Lack of moral fiber is just a fancy way of saying that someone had no guts, right? That they were a coward.
It's not that simple, Andy. Let me see if I can explain it to you. Sortie after sortie. Every pilot of fighter planes or every crew member of a Lank or any other aircraft for that matter, they risk everything up there. Day and night, we bring the war to the enemy. And guys break down. It's not that they care more about their own survival, it's that it all becomes too much for them. And sometimes, they just can't pull themselves up by the bootstraps. The things we do to each other in war. It's just not natural. One day you're dancing at home to Glenn Miller with your best gal, and the next, you're here. You witness how horrible death can be. What choice do we have? It's either them or it's us. No guts. Tell me, what guts are, Andy?
I think it takes real guts not to fight.
And let others fight your battles, sacrifice their lives? Is that fair?
And met a fellow there by the name of Percy Kears from out west. And Percy and I became friends there, and we sort of stuck together by luck of the next posting. Percy and I went through training together. The flight commander who was going to take on an op. So then I said to him, ready to take off, and there wasn't anybody who couldn't get their aircraft going, so I'd asked her, if everything gets going, I'll fly fighter cover for you, which is unusual to do such a thing, but I did, and watched Percy start off in his dive, and he just blew up. Must have got hit in one of the bombs with a piece of shrapnel or something, and it just blew her up, you know. So, sorry.
It was my stupid day, really. It was my day off, and I had gone down to the flight line, and I was waxing my aircraft so I could get another little bit of speed out of it. And the other flight said, well, Lloyd, we're short of pilots. Can you fly with us today? And I said, sure. And off we went, and my radio went out. I didn't have any radio, and I stupidly stayed with them. And we were attacked by 109s, and I didn't see it. My number 2 broke, and I was on my own. I saw 2 109s down there, and I went down, and I thought, boy, I'm going to be a hero today. And next thing I knew, I weaved, you know, looked back, and this guy was shooting at me. The aircraft was badly hit. A shell hit the fuselage right about here, and bits and pieces went through into my arm. But the airplane was still flying, so I spun down to a fairly low altitude and then headed towards home. The engine quit on me, and I found a flat spot, and I set it down there. I left everything there. Nearby was a series of trees going up the mountain, and it was a stream that had dried up, but the trees were on either side, and I felt secure in there, out of sight. And I tore my shirt up and bandaged my arm, and then walked up the stream bed. And I was well into the field when an armored car came down the road, and they took me to a casualty clearing center. I remember the doctor saying, now you start counting backwards from 10. And I don't think I got very far before I went to sleep. And when I woke up, my arm was in a bandage. However, I couldn't get any of the doctors to phone my unit to tell them that I was okay. I think it was about 10 days that my mother hadn't heard anything about it. She heard that, she got the signal that I was missing. And it must have been awful because she was all alone. Dad was in the service and he was away. I think that was probably the thing that killed her, because In 1951, she died, and it was from a nervous colitis problem that probably was generated at that time. I feel somewhat guilty about that.
Not being able to talk to your loved ones back home, that must have sucked.
Sucked?
Tough. It must have been tough.
Damn tootin', it's tough. There's a whole heap of worrying going on back home. And we don't always get their letters. They don't always get ours. Any news from the front, good or bad, never gets to the ones we left behind fast enough.
I guess the time spent not knowing must have been the worst thing of all.